Happy New Year. This is Melissa. It is Real History, and I am happy today to be talking with Nick from Hayes Reviews. Shared some of his talks, and he just covers some really great books and quite a few having to do with the roundtable groups, everything that kind of ties in a way that is complementary to Quigley and Tragedy and Hope. And so Nick, hello, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Very much looking forward to today's conversation because this really was a wonderful book. But
Yes,
it's good to be here.
it was good. So we decided we covered Aldous Huxley's Brave New World last month, and we decided I've had some docu-camera issues, so I'm just going to hold it up. This is Brave New World Revisited. And I said I had read Brave New World, but I hadn't read Brave New World Revisited. And as it turns out, that wasn't true. I have read it. This is where I have joint my notes and Alan's notes, and there's even notes in here where I'm telling him where to read, like for a recording, start here and stop here. But I have the feeling that I may not have read it, cover to cover, but I just went in looking for specific things for Alan. And so it was good to read it methodically. And it's not a long book, it's just about 200 pages. It's a quick and easy read, but it's just full of the agenda. And Nick and I were going to have dueling document cameras, but for whatever reason, the Zoom he is graciously hosting us on isn't letting me flip back and forth easily between the two of them. Some little glitch in the software, I think, of my document camera. So I may just record my footage of flipping through the book later on. We'll see how it goes. So I told him, he said this was going to be dueling docucams. I said, well, you've already won. You've already won the duel.
But the fact that you have one at all means that you're way ahead of most people. So that's good.
Oh, well, that's thanks to you. You inspired that. So if you want to just dive right in, I think you had some good ideas. You said it's only 12 chapters and we can go, you know, chapter by chapter and give some highlight quotes. You were, I have to say, impressed by all my tabs. So,
I really was. Yeah, the fact that you had tabs and labeled them, I was like, oh my goodness, that is another level of preparation because I've tabbed the pages, but I don't know what the tabs are referring to or why I tabbed them until I go back and have a look. And then I have to remind myself of why I decided to put a tab on that page. But yeah, this book is a real eye-opening insight into the mindset, I think, of the people who are rolling out the agendas, the long-term agendas that we've been born into, that we haven't given our consent to, and which, for the most part, are kind of hidden from us. And I found this to be, I was amazed with some of the things that are written in this book. To be frank, I was
mhm.
quite shocked about how on the nose and openly he describes things. I felt that it was his honest opinion. I think he was being very truthful all the way through it. And while some of the things he's describing, I think, leave a sour taste in his mouth, you also see times, occasions where his sort of, let's say, his consciousness of the class he's born into kind of shines through. And there's a
Mhm.
few interesting quotes and phrases which sort of reveal what he thinks about the rest of us.
Mhm.
So yeah, I thought we could just kind of start at the beginning and work our way through, and
Okay.
just go chapter by chapter.
Well, I will let you take the lead here. I'm ready to go. I'm just going to follow along kind of in my notes. So,
Cool. Well, this is the edition that I got hold of, and it's a hardback, and it's about, I think, a third, maybe a third edition. So it's not a four. Let's see, it says fourth impression, but you can see this is 1964, but the book itself was actually was it
59?
59?
I think it was 59, yeah.
Right. I think it says it on this one actually. Yeah, first published 1959. So I've written in the margins throughout the book the year 1959 just to remind myself when he's talking about now or the present day that was when he was writing it, because he does do a little bit of forecasting of the future and what he
Mhm.
thinks is going to happen, what's coming next. And so it's always good to remember that it was 1959 that this came out. And so the contents page, the first chapter, overpopulation. That tells you everything you need to know pretty much right there. If you know about the overpopulation myth, the incredible amount of energy and attention and effort that's gone into population control, turning it into a science, perfecting it, and how that ties into his novel Brave New World and the world that it describes. It was no surprise to me that he kicked off the book with overpopulation. But just a quick scan of the contents reveals some really interesting stuff. He's talking about propaganda in both democratic society and in dictatorship. Then he talks about the arts of selling. So this is kind of your sales, your advertising, and your marketing,
Mhm.
brainwashing, chemical persuasion, subconscious persuasion, hypnopedia, which people who've read Brave New World will be familiar with that phrase. This is the method of playing recordings to people as they sleep in order to embed certain values, certain slogans, which then they reproduce and repeat at key moments to keep them in line and thinking the right things and having the right opinions about things, right? So, kind of like people are trained to wave their hand and dismiss certain information by saying, "Oh, that's conspiracy theory. I'm not going to look at that." Hypnopedia is Huxley's uh, sort of imaginary method of getting people to that state of just chucking these quotes out without thinking. But
What's interesting though, sorry to interrupt you, but
go
what's
ahead.
interesting about hypnopedia and the imaginary technique is that it's not that dissimilar from what the psychiatrist Ewan Cameron used when he was working for the CIA out of Canada. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he
No, I'm not.
had a process. It's shocking. There have actually been some good documentaries about it, but he had a process called depatterning, which was combination of sensory deprivation, et cetera, et cetera. And then he would reprogram people by playing things repeatedly. And he destroyed quite a few lives. This was a CIA program. So I'll link to things on you and Cameron, and Alan Watt has discussed him before. But so the hypnopedia, it was something that was, actively being pursued in psychiatric circles to great detriment. But I'm sure that there are probably studies and programs that are going on that are hidden or that have gone on that we're completely unaware of.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I think one thing that we find is that Huxley is often talking about we, and as a reader, we are likely to interpret that as he's talking about all of humanity. But I think in some cases, he's talking about we, the people who are carrying out those kinds of studies and agendas and experiments and scientific inquiry into the
Mhm.
control of the rest of us, right?
Mhm.
So it's sometimes I think he is talking about we, humanity, but in other times I think he's talking about we, the scientific elite and the
Mhm.
class that he's born into, and so it's good to keep an eye out and sort of be discerning for those different versions. But
Yeah.
I'm sure and he says in later in the book he mentions other thinkers and scientists, psychologists, and he refers to other books as well. So that's another reason why I love this book is because he refers to a lot of other books that I hadn't
Mhm.
heard of,
Mhm.
and so that gave me other sort of avenues for research opened up to me. So that was great. But yeah, so we've got a great list of contents here, lots of topics that'll be familiar to anyone who's interested in researching the kind of things that Alan Watt talked so much about in his shows, as well as some of the topics that I've talked about on the book readings that I've done. Very familiar list of a very familiar menu of topics and subjects, I would say.
Mhm.
But it's just quite a short book, 151 pages. And we can start with the foreword, which is only 2 pages long. But what stood out to me in the foreword is how he talks about simplicity versus truth. And he's saying you can't really encapture the full truth of a thing because it's such a big subject and so complex that you have to do a certain amount of simplifying, which means you have to do a certain amount of editing and chopping things out and leaving things out. But he says, nevertheless, he's going to do his best to get to concentrate upon the essentials of a situation. And then he says, in this way, he's going to tell you a lot more than the dangerous quarter truths and half truths, which have always been the current coin of thought. It's an interesting way to start off the book. He's sort of saying, yes, it's a short book, and it's not going to go into all the nitty gritty and the ins and outs of everything that I'm talking about, but it's going to give you enough of the gist of things. And I think it's really true that he mentions that. It's what he gives you here. If more people could read this book, I know as a sort of introductory book to, the quote unquote elite, the way they think, what they're trying to do in the world, it's hard to think of a better book, I think.
That's true.
And what he says is the subject of freedom and its enemies is enormous. The implication being that that's the subject and the topic of the book. So he's actually talking about freedom. He's talking about what leads to freedom and what leads away from freedom. And that's what I was most surprised at when I was reading through this, is that he gives some really accurate, he shows that he has a very accurate understanding of true human freedom, what it looks like, and how it's being basically destroyed and eradicated pretty much. And that was 1959. And look how much further we've come at this point. So topic of the book, freedom and its enemies. Then he says, finally, and on the last page of the foreword, he's talking about what he leaves out of the picture. He says, omitted from the picture here, he actually doesn't discuss the weapons and gadgets which have so powerfully strengthened the hands of the world's rulers against their subjects. So just interesting here that he admits the world is ruled, and the people who aren't, if you're not a ruler, then you're a subject. And he makes that distinction very clearly, and he seems to be very comfortable with that assessment of the fact, which reminds me of his interview where he says words to that effect. Oh, there's a ruling elite of the world, and I see no reason why they should ever stop being the rulers of the world. So he's firmly entrenched in this mindset of the small ruling class dominating and domineering over everybody else. Right. And what I liked about this as well is he's talking about one of the things he doesn't discuss is the cost of what every nation refers to as quote unquote defense. And I just really appreciated that, because we all have, like in England, we have the Ministry of Defense. And, it's the Ministry of War. It's the Ministry of killing foreign people. It's it's the Ministry of creating ingenious ways to end the lives of people who aren't from this country. But we don't call it that. We call it the Ministry of Defense.
Yeah. Yes.
So reminding me a little bit of Bertrand Russell and his sort of anti-war position on a lot of things, and how he became the kind of anti-war philosopher, didn't he? And that was sort of his role to play.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it really for the foreword. And then we're straight into chapter 1, which is overpopulation. And I should just say here as well, if at any point we need to hurry it up and move forward, we can, and just let me know, because when I was going back and I thought I'll just refresh myself of the key quotes and the ideas, I found myself just rereading every single word.
Well, I know, and this is when you had suggested we do, major quotes and everything. I just started off like, oh, and here's a quote, and there's a quote, and it got a little bit crazy, and finally by about the 7th or 8th chapter, I'm like, slow down, so I don't have so many of them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't amazing quotes to be found, and it really is one that you just want to read aloud to people and go, can you believe he said this?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm even thinking, I'm like, I've got to read this on the channel, just get the whole thing in its entirety on record, because
yes,
it's going to sit on my shelf next to Next Million Years by by Charles Galton Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
It's a slender volume, but it just exactly that reaction. Can you believe that he's saying these things? But he's not just the arrogance and the pomposity and the incredible hubris of the elite mindset. It's also, he's actually telling you how it works.
Mhm.
and this is what is happening, and this is what's going to happen, and it's a very stark and frank admission of the way the world works. He doesn't give you the, oh, you live in a democracy and you get to vote and you're in control and you have the most freedom of anyone that's ever, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He really just lays it out and tells you up front. So
Well, there's something about him, and we touched on this when we talked about Brave New World, and which I think bears repeating or rewording in some way. Huxley appeared to have been on his own journey. He's clearly who he is from his class with his biases and prejudices because of that. But he's also on a journey as a human. And however much he is the product of his own class's breeding program and all of the indoctrination he had from his education, he is bright enough to see where these technologies and techniques are going to take all of humanity. And so when he's talking about freedom, I think he's aware that the beast that they have been creating is a beast that the elite class will not have. I don't remember what, you probably remember that there, but the controlling, there's a term he uses. We'll come to that later, but this controlling elite, they will also be victimized, frankly, by this. And we don't know if it's a hollow argument or not about AI and how it will take over and how it'll get out of hand and so forth, and people coming down on both sides of the argument. But there is truth that the world that they've created, that they've envisioned for so long, um, they will have a loss of freedom too, and
yeah,
a
I think the
lot.
phrase might be controlling oligarchy. I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, but
Yeah, that is a good phrase, but I don't think that's what he uses. But we'll
mm,
come to that when we get in there.
yeah. So he starts the first chapter on talking about how when he wrote Brave New World in 1931, he was describing the completely organized society, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness, and how Brave New World is a place where perfect efficiency left no room for freedom or personal initiative. And then immediately after that, he says that now in 1959, he's a great deal less optimistic. I mean, you had to be pretty pessimistic to write Brave New World in the first place. And in the intervening 15 years, there's been World War II,
Mhm.
and and then Orwell has also brought out, published 1984.
Mhm.
And so he's writing this book in the new context with the developments that he's lived through, and he's saying he's much less optimistic than he was when he wrote the Brave New World, which is quite so that gives you an idea of the sort of content of the book and what he's going to be revealing
Mhm.
and forecasting and describing for the future. Because he says here that in 1959, he says, even in countries that have a tradition of democratic government, freedom and even the desire for freedom seem to be on the wane. In the rest of the world, freedom for individuals has already gone or is manifestly about to go. Right. So it's quite a stark thing to say. But I think it would suit the mood of the times very well. It makes sense to be
Mhm.
feeling this way at this time in history. And then he goes on to describe how what has been learned is that it's much more effective to keep control of people by rewarding the behavior you want instead of punishing the behavior that you do not want. And this is the idea of killing them with kindness, and this is why you see that in his novel, people are given lots of pleasurable, happy experiences. They're always comfortable. They can always have an instantaneous hit of soma whenever they like. They play games in their free time. No deep thinking, no consideration of the more profound questions about life and where are we from and who are we and where are we going. It's all instantaneous, instant gratification, of joyful pleasure in the moment. And that's what he's saying is this has been figured out. And this, I thought, reminded me at least, reminded me of Pavlov and his work. He says that government through terror works on the whole less well than government through the non-violent manipulation of the environment and of the thoughts and feelings of individual men, women, and children. So I thought this manipulation of the environment was quite an interesting phrase, because I think quite often we don't consider our environment as having been manipulated. But the fact that there's televisions and the streets and the street lights and the supermarkets and the cinemas, all these things are manipulated, designed, and given to us. We don't really participate so much in the creation of our own environment. We don't tend to build our own homes. I say we, at least where I'm from, the houses are already built. The infrastructure projects that we have in our towns and cities are built by someone else for us. We're not that involved in the creation and the design of our environment. And that phrase stood out to me as I thought the environment really has a massive impact on the behavior of the organism in the environment, doesn't it? And so when you're living in this totally artificial environment that's been created by other people, it's going to have a major impact on the way you behave and how you act and what you do in your life. So that was quite a curious phrase that I hadn't thought about that. I always think of the manipulation as being a direct manipulation of our mind or our mindset or our worldview or our behavior. I hadn't thought about that layer of guiding our behavior by but it makes perfect sense, right? Because here in England we have traffic lights and we have crossings, and you have to stop and wait for the little green man, and then you go, and then the red light comes on and you stop. And whereas in places that I've lived before, such as Cambodia or Vietnam, where the traffic control system is non-existent, everyone's just going, it's this chaos, but it works somehow. There's streets over there with a constant flow of mopeds and cars going down it. And the only way you can cross is if you just start walking into it and you choose your pace and you go in a straight line and you maintain your pace, and all the traffic just goes around you as you make your way across the road. And that's the only way to get through it. So it's this idea that he'll talk about a little later on, actually, which is the organization and the desire to organize everything and control it and plan it and say when you can go and when you can stop, that is so detrimental to the well-being of humans. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Yeah, he compares 1984 as the society controlled by punishment with his Brave New World, the society controlled by reward. And then he goes on to talk about impersonal forces. So this was quite curious to me, and I did a little question mark. He talks about there's impersonal forces which seem to be pushing us all in the direction of the brave new worldian nightmare. And I thought that's interesting, because I thought this was all being done deliberately by his friends, relatives, maybe his class of people. So I was interested to know what it was that he determined were the impersonal forces propelling us towards the Brave New World. And of course, it turns out to be biology, aka reproduction, because as we know, the people who are so concerned with overpopulation in the world, they don't like the fact that there's a bunch of us down here who are making babies indiscriminately without their permission and their permits and their.
I have to say, though, it's funny. I noticed that too. I think that there is probably nothing more personal than reproduction. But to him, it's just an impersonal force.
That's a really good point, and it reminds me of the oxymoron casual sex. This idea that exists. How can that, like being naked with another person and really being like, what can be casual about that? There's nothing that can be casual about that, but we've been just sort of gaslit into thinking that can exist, right?
Yeah.
So he goes on to talk about how this impersonal force of reproduction is causing the problem, overpopulation. But then another problem that he states is how we've we've developed our what he calls, so he talks about birth control, but he talks about death control as well. And he talks about how we've managed to save a lot of lives using things such as penicillin, DDT, and clean water. And I thought DDT, that's a real sign of the time, isn't it? That he's talking about that as a boon, because when I looked up DDT, it turns out there's a lot of. I remember hearing a rap song about it by the band Jurassic 5, or at least a lyric. And I thought, I don't think that's a good thing. But he's talking about it like it's a good thing. So I looked it up, and indeed, DDT, it's an endocrine disruptor. And if you are exposed to it chronically, then it can affect reproduction. It's an organochloride and an insecticide. And so I think there's videos of people getting sprayed with DDT, right? And it was hailed as I think it kills mosquitoes and therefore saves a lot of lives. Is that right? But it actually turned out to be
You
bad.
are right, and Rachel Carson wrote her seminal work called, I think, Silent Spring was the title of it. However, this may be controversial, but Alan had some very different thoughts about DDT than the mainstream maligning of it, and showing that he said, look, anything that you overuse or spray in that effect could kill birds, could kill fish, et cetera, et cetera. But he said, properly used, this was never designed to do that. Properly used, it was designed to
Yeah.
kill mosquitoes and other disease producing pests. And I mean, like I said, it's controversial, but he said if this was properly used, the malaria and other diseases associated with mosquitoes would be absolutely nil. That would bring the African populations up to a healthier standard of living. You see what so at a time when the environmental movement was really taking off, you had books like Silent Spring and you had all this outrage, and you saw, as Alan said, the same dead fish and the same dead birds shown over and over and over again. But so just food for thought.
Yeah, excellent. And I've heard a similar ideas about the book Silent Spring, which I haven't read, but
Uh-huh.
I've heard people say, oh, it's a must read and quite a it was the first of its kind. But then other people sort of saying, oh, well, it's a little bit overblown, maybe over exaggerated the dangers of things, and a little bit on the side of propaganda itself. But as with anything, what's the phrase? The the something like the poisons in the dose or something. You can kill yourself with water, but you can't. But you need water to survive.
Right.
So it's about the amount, using it responsibly, accurate, using it properly. Makes a lot more sense to me than just the outright this thing is terrible. But again, it's that dialectical black versus white type of thinking that
Mhm.
is so powerful and that is so alluring and tempting to many of us, isn't it? Just to get us falling into that
Oh,
it's good or it's
absolutely.
bad.
I read Silent Spring years and years ago, many years ago, and I of course fell in line with that. Oh, this is terrible. But as you take in more information, then you realize that this might have been part of an organized release of information that was to have us thinking about the environment in a different way.
Hmm.
There's good stewardship of the environment. There's no doubt about that, proper stewardship. But typically, that's not what these characters, they're all just chewing their knuckles over these impersonal forces called reproduction.
Well, this page here has a very important quote, which I think gives you an idea into what Huxley's view of the rest of us was, where he's talking about the differences between death control and birth control. And he says, death control can be provided for a whole people by a few technicians working in the pay of a benevolent government. Birth control, on the other hand, depends on the cooperation of an entire people. It must be practiced by countless individuals from whom it demands more intelligence and willpower than most of the world's teeming illiterates possess. So yeah, when you're toing and froing, like, is he on our side, like trying to reveal the plans of the elite, or is he part of them and just telling us how it is and how it's always going to be? That phrase, that the world's teeming illiterates, kind of gives you an insight into what he really thought about those outside of his own class, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a bunch of anchovies.
So then he goes on to talk about how the increases in population and how fast it's going up, and how public health is getting in the way because it's making more people live. But he doesn't provide any references and sources. But you know, he provides a lot of references in other parts of the book where he mentions authors and he quotes passages from their books.
Mhm.
But for this little bit about how quickly the world's population is going up, he doesn't provide any. He doesn't even mention. I guess was this before limits to growth? This might have been a few years before limits to
Yeah, and
growth,
limits to growth, I think, was 72.
right? But then we've got Huxley, we have Charles Galton Darwin, and I think Bertrand Russell as well, all seeding that idea of overpopulation as a problem, as the main issue, right? So it goes back. So there's a whole part about how quickly, how slowly the population used to rise and now how fast it's going. And he says on page 17, the population problem has not been solved. On the contrary, it is becoming graver and more formidable with every passing year. It is against this grim biological background that all the political, economic, cultural, and psychological dramas of our time are being played out. And I underlined that because I thought that what's really important is for anyone who's trying to understand the dramas of our time, it's really important to know that the people running the show or trying to run the show have this view of the world's teeming illiterates and the necessity to manage them and domesticate them and keep them in line and in check, and the population at a manageable level, right? It's this kind of arrogance of we're the managers of the rest of humanity.
Mhm.
So I thought he's actually right there, that it's not the fact that the number of people is a problem. It's the fact that they're obsessed with the number of people and trying to get it all under control, that you need to bear in mind when you're looking at how things pan out, whether it's wars, whether it's economic hardships or difficulties or crises. And he does talk about the importance of crises in a later chapter. So then he goes on to say here, the masses. The masses of mankind, so far as the masses of mankind are concerned, the coming time will not be the space age. It will be the age of overpopulation. So he's really hammering the nail home in this opening chapter. He says that if we don't solve the problem on page 19, it will create conditions in which individual freedom and the social decencies of the democratic way of life will become impossible, almost unthinkable. So again, it's that interesting that he talks about individual freedom, and he does mention it in a few places, and I think it's kind of this obsession with trying to control people and manage everybody and hook everybody into a scientific system of control that is causing individual freedom to be under threat. So quite honest and open about things. He goes on, let's see. He talks about a little bit about the nature of power on page 21, saying that even those who have not sought it but have had power forced upon them tend to acquire a taste for more power. So he's kind of giving us, again, another insight into the mindset of the elite and how once they've got it, he's talking kind of about himself a little bit here. He's born into it. A lot of the children of these elite families, I suppose, get sort of power forced upon them to an extent because they're born into these families, given a certain worldview and education, and then sort of told you've got a responsibility to keep this going, right?
Mhm.
And then they'll tend to acquire a taste for more and want to entrench and keep that power. And it reminds me a little of what Alan used to say, which is that to get into that big club, you would have to build and maintain wealth and then hold on to it for a few generations, which makes a lot of sense to me that that would be the kind of price of entry. And so making sure that your offspring and progeny would then carry on playing the game and furthering the plans that had been put in place that before they were born would be really a really critical part of keeping and maintaining that power.
It's funny that you highlighted that because this morning I was thinking about, the stresses of life, how you pay your bills and big bills that come and these things crowd in on your creativity and your intellectual headspace, so that you have time to research and think about other things. And I was reminded that Alan told us, he pointed out that scala, the word for scholarship in school, came from the word leisure. It was the leisure class who had the time, and the leisure class is the wealthy. They have the time to do whatever pursuit they want to do. And so they can, they can think about atoms and, whatever else they want to think about. And because they're not, their mind isn't crowded with worry and stress and, financial troubles. So that's I think they certainly know who they are. They're born into incredible privilege. And another thing that Alan pointed out about this class of people, I don't know if you've ever heard him say this, but H.G. Wells was not born into this class. His mother was a housekeeper for very wealthy people. So he was probably one of those people who was picked up, lifted up, given a certain training, and kind of brought in to a certain level in the Fabians. And he had an idea what was happening. But Alan pointed out that the man was terrified. He'd see the hoi polloi passing his window, and he just would do and say and write and promote anything that would keep him from falling back down into the class from whence he came.
Yeah, that makes
Yes.
perfect sense. And I think uh, it reminds me of this idea that you always need to keep around a certain number of homeless people
Hmm.
to sort of
Hmm.
keep the majority working and paying their taxes because you don't want to
Yeah,
end up like them, do you?
that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's this like, you got to keep, there's this perpetuation of the master slave dynamic. And you see this in the workplace, in the corporate structures. It's always a case of there's somebody above you and there's somebody below you, and you suck up to the and do what the people above you tell you, and you're better than the people below you, and they do the same to you. But it's perpetuated so that everybody is both master and slave at the same time, which of course
Mhm.
is a psychological fracturing. It's a contradiction. And you're switching in and out of roles all the time, and it causes a real maybe schizophrenic type of personality to have to live in that circumstance. But it's very important to keep the people where you want them thinking they've got it good, so they'll keep going along,
Mhm.
ticking the box, voting for the red or the blue team when the vote comes around, and allowing their money to be taken off them and spent on whatever it is that they like to spend it on, which is never anything that benefits us really. So yeah, that really does make perfect sense. Um, Going just finishing up this chapter, and then we'll probably have to be a bit speedy for the rest of them. But this sets the
Mhm.
tone really well for the rest of the book. Is the final point he's making about the probability of overpopulation, saying that that it's going to lead through unrest to dictatorship, and this becomes a virtual certainty. And then he makes a prediction that 20 years from now, all the world's overpopulated and underdeveloped countries will be under some form of totalitarian rule, probably by the Communist Party. And so I
Mhm.
think that particular prediction didn't age too well. But what he did get was that the rollout of the socialist system,
Mhm.
the Fabian society and their permeation and penetration of the socialist agenda slowly, tortoise like, step by step, I think kind of is what actually happened, even though we weren't overtly, all these countries weren't overtly under the control of the Communist Party.
Mhm.
They ended up being sort of influenced and impacted by the socialist movement, which, kind of the same thing, just with a different time scale on it. And then he concludes the chapter with by talking about liberty, and these are really critical words here. He says, liberty, on page 23, liberty, as we all know, cannot flourish in a country that is permanently on a war footing or even a near-war footing. Permanent crisis justifies permanent control of everybody and everything by the agencies of the central government. And permanent crisis is what we have to expect in a world in which overpopulation is producing a state of things in which dictatorship under communist auspices becomes almost inevitable. So he's blaming overpopulation when I think really the problem is the fact that these people want to stay in power and maintain that power at any cost. And the way they're going to do that is to make sure that there's continual crises, whether they're war, whether it's famine, disease, pestilence, all the classics, weather events. As long as you can maintain this back-to-back series of problems, then you can maintain your control and your power, and the requirement for you to be mummying and daddying everybody, because people tend to call for somebody to fix the problem, because most of us don't have the sort of wherewithal to be totally self-sufficient and robust in our ability to survive through hardship. Many of us are plugged into the system, hooked into the system, and therefore when things start to look a bit shaky and problematic, we kind of say, help, help, save us. Here, take our freedoms away. And just so long as you look after us and protect us and make sure we don't die. And, we saw a lot of that over the last 4 years. So quite a powerful ending to the chapter, and very important message about liberty there. And really puts it into perspective when we're getting crises after crises after crises, when the news is nothing. But I put the news on, I think it was Boxing Day or the day after Boxing Day, we put the news on, and they're the first three stories that were on the news, and this is the local news. The first one was a hit and run that led to the death of two people, I think. The second one was also a hit and run. They did two back-to-back hit and runs in a row, and the third story was a stabbing. And it's just kind of like, stay indoors, it's dangerous out there. Everyone's, just real fear mongering, real a message of be scared, be insecure, be worried all the time. And so keeping people permanently disheveled and uncomfortable and scared and fearful because of these back-to-back crises is a tactic. And it's a tactic to reduce liberty and make sure people don't have any of it. So quite a powerful opening chapter there.
It was, and I think that he is blaming overpopulation, but I would say that I think overpopulation is probably as made up a problem as climate change. It is not really a problem. I think the biggest threat to liberty are control freaks. And that's who's in charge. But you mentioned something. We're going to get to this. This is in the chapter called brainwashing. But because you mentioned it, I wanted to. I think I'll take over in the dueling document cam. I'll see if I can make mine pop up here.
It looks good. Yeah, it's clear, really clear. I can read it.
Okay. All right. So can you see that? That's Alan's pen here. And
Right.
he has written 2 words, evening news. And
Wow.
this isn't, because you're saying the stay indoors, you've got the 2 hit and runs and a stabbing. And we'll come back to this, but they're talking about the technique of brainwashing and propaganda. And it says they prove, for example, that Hitler was quite right and maintaining that mass meetings at night were more effective than mass meetings in the daytime. During the day, he wrote, man's willpower revolts with highest energy against any attempt at being forced under another's will and another's opinion. In the evening, however, they succumb more easily to the dominating force of a stronger will. So I thought that was interesting. Well, if you want, we can just try this out. I'll pop back here to overpopulation and just get a couple of things. You already said that the punishment that reward was better than punishment as incentivization. And I just made the note that this is social engineering. And you read a little bit there about the Brave New Worldian nightmare, and that you gave this quote: "This impersonal pushing is being consciously accelerated by representatives of commercial and political organizations who have developed a number of new techniques for manipulating." Alan's note in the margin is NGOs. And that is very much how so much of these techniques of control come into place. And I think that that is kind of it. Now, if we can we see this clearly?
Yeah, it looks really good.
Okay, good. I'm in Quants chapter 2, which is quantity, quality, and morality. And he's talking about the creation of different types of people in his Brave New World fantasy, as he calls it, and down to the creatures that were almost subhuman, but they were capable of performing unskilled work. And this is just a political aside of a brouhaha that occurred over the weekend, but Musk and his Doge sidekick, Vivek Ramaswamy, I guess Musk tweeted something like he was going to go to war, and it was very crude what he said. And over these H-1B visas, which is allowing skilled people, because remember, Trump's platform has always been, first time he ran and now, closing the borders and sending illegals home and everything. And so Musk said he'll absolutely go to war to keep the H-1B visa people here in the country. This is what they call skilled labor, educated labor. And I was really reminded of this quote here: the creatures finally decanted were almost subhuman, but they were capable of performing unskilled work, and when properly conditioned, detentioned by free and frequent, detentioned, like having their tension removed by free and frequent access to the opposite sex, constantly distracted by gratuitous entertainment, and reinforced in their good behavior patterns by daily doses of soma, they could be counted on to give no trouble to their superiors. And I thought of that section when the whole H1 B visa thing blew up on the weekend. I thought, well, that's what they're doing. They're bringing in the skilled labor from other countries, justifying it. And then look, they're saying, oh, well, we just don't have those kind of people here. And they can easily point to what hit and runs and stabbings and tattooed porn addicted people, and this is our worker class, so we had to go elsewhere to get what we need. But they definitely kick us when we're down here. I had
And it's
made
that
an
classic thing as well of making the education here, the mandatory government education is so useless and not fit for purpose. And then they're saying, oh, well, we need to import people who are skilled workers. You know,
yes,
they're de-skilling the people who are already here, and then blaming the people for that and saying that's why we got to bring other people in.
yeah, it's absolutely, or as Alan would say, they break the legs of the cow and then kick it because it can't get up. And that is, the point that we're making there. One of my one of my notes that I made in the front years ago for me and Alan was likening page 30 to the movie Idiocracy, because when he is talking about the classes, the wonder drugs, in other words, death control. We have inadequate birth control, but we have adequate death control, and that is allowing what he called the teeming illiterates to breed. And of course, if you are able to step back and see it from their point of view, as was humorously and sadly shown in the movie Idiocracy, that's exactly where they have us, where we're, one could argue since they've broken the legs of the cow and kicking us, that positive eugenics would be a good thing. So
Well, doesn't he open this chapter as well with an admission that in the book, at least in Brave New World, he says eugenics and dysgenics were practiced systematically.
yes.
And I think a lot of people, at least myself, when I was learning about eugenics, it took quite a while before somebody said to me, eugenics and there's eugenics and dysgenics. They're two different things. Because I always thought of eugenics as something to do with, well, just I associated it with World War II and the tiny mustache man and everything that he got up to during that time, getting rid of people that you didn't want. But actually, eugenics means like the uplift and the improvement of the genes and the genetic stock. And dysgenics is the disruption and the interfering and the down regulation of the genetic stock. And so what we were just talking about, what Alan said about breaking the legs of the cow, that is the dysgenics. That is the making sure that the wrong class of people never rise up and get too much intelligence or ability or skill or awareness or
Mm-hmm.
knowledge or wisdom, and making sure they don't get any of this stuff by handicapping them, giving them bad information, giving them entertainment, taking away their ability to think critically and logically. That is a process that's going on, and he admits the dysgenics. He says in the book, eugenics and dysgenics were practiced systematically, but then he says in this chapter that in my book, it's on page 28. He says, in the rich, industrialized, and democratic society, owing to the random but effective practice of dysgenics, IQs and physical vigor are on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have my book come on there, but there it is. Random but effective practice of dysgenics.
Yes,
That
yes.
was one of the quotes that really, I was like, what? He's just telling you that it's happening. It's being
The
done.
the other thing that's right in there is that I'll switch over to document. Well, before I do that, I just wanted to say that Tiny Mustache Man got his ideas from the British Eugenics Society and the American Eugenics Society. And one project that I did for Alan, which I still have on a hard drive, is I downloaded every single copy of the British Eugenics Society. I think it goes back like 100 years. I mean, I
Wow.
just faithful. It took me a while to do that, but I have it all. And then I found what I could from the American eugenics. But you saw these Better Family magazines where it showed the, impossibly beautiful husband and wife and their two children, or maybe three, but usually two, who were just so, gorgeous and, they were perfect. And this is showing you the right way to breed up eugenically. And all of these ideas were heavily in practice, both dysgenics. I mean, the US, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the US was practicing sterilization on the undesirables into the 70s. Terrible. So,
It's unbelievable.
yeah. And I may
Well,
be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that people were still being sterilized in the 1970s.
I think we get an insight into the mindset of people who would go along with that and carry it out. because he says down here on page 29, because this chapter is all about, he's saying the double whammy of the problem is that we're getting more people while at the same time churning out people of lesser and lesser quality, let's
Mhm.
say. And he says here, what about the congenitally insufficient organisms? Not
Mhm.
human beings, not people, not men and women and children, the insufficient organisms whom our medicine and our social services now preserve so that they may propagate their kind.
Mhm.
What, yeah, to help the unfortunate is obviously good, but the wholesale transmission to our descendants of the results of unfavorable mutations and the progressive contamination of the genetic pool from which the members of our species will have to draw are no less obviously bad. Yeah, just so pretty stark admission there, and window into the mindset of this sort of technocratic scientific cast.
Yeah, it's cuddly. It's a cuddly mindset. Warm and fuzzy. They just love us so much. This is a point I don't remember if I do think this is one that I actually played as a redux a few weeks ago. I was listening to so many and I don't remember what I settled on, but I think this one came up where Alan was sitting in for a host and he took some phone calls and one person wanted to have an argument more or less about dysgenics versus eugenics. And Alan wasn't having it because the argument wasn't even being raised correctly. And when the man hung up and they went to the commercial break and then came back, Alan said, "No, no, that somebody like this is just revealing that they're really a eugenicist." And he said, people that want to give you the good argument for eugenics and the reasons why dysgenics might be useful, et cetera, et cetera. He said, what they can't wrap their heads around is they're not going to be picked. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
it happens so often that the people who support and advocate for these plans and schemes, they're the ones who are going to get like lined up against the wall first,
Yeah.
because they're the ones who are willing to do the dirty on
Mm-hmm.
the culture and the society that they've been born into and grown up in, and so they can't be trusted, you know.
No,
So once you've got them to
exactly.
do
Yeah.
your bidding, then they're the first to go. You got to get
Yeah.
rid of them.
Yeah. They are, I mean, Bezmenov talked about that beautifully. Useful idiots are indeed the first to be eliminated. Well, I didn't really have any other key things marked off. I've got quite a bit in over organization and propaganda, but if you want to dive into chapter 3, which is over organization, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this chapter, this is when I really, the first two chapters, I kind of breezed through them. Not a lot of stuff that I hadn't heard before, but this one was where I was like, okay, this is a keeper. This is one I gotta really pay attention to and talk about, and maybe get on the record on the channel, because I don't know, something about this one just really, I don't know. It's hard to describe. It's not like I enjoyed reading it, but to see such condensed, focused, um, distilled account
Mhm.
of the way things are and the mindset of who's doing it,
Mhm.
it was pretty powerful. So so what he's saying in this chapter, which is entitled "Over Organization," he's talking about how the technological advances that we've enjoyed have these are one of the impersonal forces he talks about, right? Is the development of technology, which pushes us towards this tendency of organization over, and then too much organization squeezes out the individual, and the humanity from the individual, because it regiments and forces people to conform, and then become uniform eventually.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I thought, firstly, the thing that stood out to me was like, that's not an impersonal force. There's people designing and building this technology, and
Mhm.
there's people funding it, and there's technology that's being hidden, and discontinued and taken away, right? So it's a very controlled, deliberate planning of what technology is coming through and is made available. I think a lot of people don't realize that the technology we have is not the cutting edge, best technology that is out there. It's the technology that's been authorized to be used on us,
Mhm.
and it all serves a purpose, such as
Mhm.
the street lights. In England, we had these really nice incandescent sort of yellowish street lights. And I remember them as a kid being in the back of the car, going home from visiting my nana or something, and I'd be very sleepy, and it was kind of a comforting place to be. I'm famous in my family for napping in the car, not when I'm driving, but if I'm a passenger, I'll be gone because I tend to just be very relaxed, the rhythm and the motion of driving, you know. And I remember these incandescent yellow light bulbs. Nowadays, there are all these bright surgical white LED lights, the kind of lights that I use these glasses to filter out to make them a
Mhm.
little easier on the eyes, right? That's not because this LED, and we're told it's energy efficient. And maybe it is, maybe it does use up less energy, but the effect that it has on biology, the effect that it has on human well-being, not to mention I've heard that potentially information can be transmitted in this light as well, that can be received and picked up by our cells.
Mhm.
But so the point is just that the technology we have is being given to us for a reason, every aspect of it. And I think people don't realize that that is the case in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
back to the book. So what he's saying here in the introduction to this chapter is that most of humanity is facing the choice between anarchy and totalitarian control. And I underline that because I the I've heard Mark Passio talk about anarchy and define it as an, which is a prefix that means without, and archy comes from archon, which means a ruler. So the word anarchy can literally be broken down into without ruler. But it's so often associated with chaos and maybe gangs and violence and food and resource wars. But actually, just the technical, literal interpretation of the word can just mean without somebody ruling over you, that's a concept I like. I like the idea of no
Yeah.
masters, no slaves, right?
Yeah, Alan has pointed out that same connection before, and it definitely makes you think differently about anarchy.
Yeah. And so I don't know Huxley's use of the word or where he's coming from when he says this. He's probably coming from the chaotic, but it was an interesting admission because on one side of things, you've got the totalitarian control with the top down, rigid structure of rules and punishments and rewards. And then on the other side of it, you've got anarchy where there is no ruler. People
Mhm.
rule themselves, and we interact on a voluntary basis, and we get
Mhm.
things done according to what is needed with the people around us and the communities we are living in. And it's more decentralized, let's say.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I thought that was just interesting because it's kind of true that that is the situation we face. And part of the problem is most people are so scared at the prospect of having to rule themselves and be responsible for their own lives and the lives of maybe their children or their loved ones and their immediate family. They would rather outsource that to some sort of ruler, some sort of totalitarian controller, because then, it's a bit easier that way, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Bill Cooper would famously say that people will love socialism, love it because somebody else is in charge. They're telling you what to do. And, you know, I mean, Bill Cooper was funny. He'd say, the sheeple,
Yeah,
they'll love it.
they can't get enough of it. Um, yeah. So then he refers to the blind biological enemy of freedom. That's our desire to procreate is a blind biological enemy of freedom. He says it's allied with immensely powerful forces generated by the very advances in technology. Then he goes on to say that the advances in technology, these advances are the fruits of moral and intellectual virtues for which one can feel nothing but admiration. So presumably he's talking about machine guns and submarines, nuclear weapons. I don't even know if he's being like ironic or sarcastic there, or if he genuinely thinks that. But that bit was that gave me a chuckle.
Yeah. Well, and I also read it that we're supposed to see their moral and intellectual virtues and go, oh yes, yes,
Thank you for your LED street
yes,
lights.
that's right.
Um, so continuing on, he's talking about how economic power tends to become concentrated and centralized due to the technology that we're enjoying by our virtuous and morally superior scientists. And this is a problem because as you get the centralization of power, then that's bad for the average Joe and Jane on the street. And then this bit was very revealing here, where he mentioned a book that might be familiar to people in the audience. He says on page 34 in my edition that in a capitalist democracy such as the United States, it is controlled by what Professor C. Wright Mills has called the power elite. This power elite directly employs several millions of the country's working force in its factories, offices, and stores, controls many millions more by lending them the money to buy its products, and through its ownership of the media of mass communication, influences the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions of virtually everybody. To parody the words of Winston Churchill, never have so many been manipulated so much by so few.
Mhm.
That was a mic drop moment for Aldous Huxley there. I was surprised to see him reference this C. Wright Mills book, though, because I'd heard of that from, I don't know, just, I haven't read it, but I put it in the Behold a Pale Horse category of books, you know, the conspiracy research sort of um, collection, let's say. But
Mhm.
so I was just surprised to see it pop up here. You know, it did take me off guard. I was like, what? Isn't that a isn't that a conspiracy book?
It's an open conspiracy book.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's the open conspiracy. Um, so then he goes on and he's talking about modern technology has led to the concentration of economic and political power and to the development of a society controlled politely and inconspicuously in the democracies by big business and big government. So again, it's these admissions of the way things are, the way things really work, not trying to hide it or trying to sugarcoat it. But then he goes on to talk about the effects on individual people who are in this situation, and he quotes a psychiatrist called Dr. Eric Fromm, who I looked up, and it turns out he's a Frankfurt School psychiatrist.
Yes, he is.
And I don't know much more about him or his work, but I did check that, and I know a little bit about the Frankfurt School. They have a lot to answer for. But I think he gives Huxley quotes then a fairly what I would an assessment that I would agree with, which is talking about how he says the people who are most normal, i.e., the people who are getting on fine with the way things are tend to be the most mentally ill and
Mhm.
hopeless victims of contemporary Western society.
Yes. Yes.
And then continuing on the following page, talking about how they are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. Um, and these millions of abnormally normal people still cherish the illusion of individuality, but in fact, they have been, to a great extent, de individualized. Their conformity is developing into something like uniformity. And this bit stood out to me very much because of what we talked about in the last discussion, and with regard to Alan's work and his emphasis on the importance of the individual and how there's no one size fits all. There's no real groups that you can join that are going to change and solve the problem. it is really an individual case by case, person by person basis of doing that work, going on that journey to find out who they are and where they fit in and what particular solutions they need to apply in their own lives. And that's the only way it can work. So again, I think quite a quite a revelation that this is all this effect. I think is not accidental. It's known, and they're doing it on purpose. And Huxley's trying to
Mhm.
blame. Oh, it's the impersonal forces,
Mhm.
but at the same time, he sort of you can't. He's telling you that it's been done on purpose, and it's been done
Mhm.
to you. It's being done to you and to
Mhm.
us, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I like that line there where he said, uniformity and freedom are incompatible.
Yes.
Uniformity and mental health are incompatible too. And this really was a key thing for Alan is that, free human beings are each unique, not one like the other, and given to spontaneity and expressions and outpouring of their creativity and so forth. And that is what is to be squashed or is being squashed in a uniform, standardized culture.
Right. And then he says here as well, science may be defined as the reduction of multiplicity to unity. And I just did a little note, scientism, not the
Mhm.
scientific method of inquiry of gathering knowledge in order to test hypotheses and understand the way things work, but scientism, the scientific elite mindset of getting everything tracked, traced, and data based and making it all predictable. And the way you make everything predictable is by conforming it all to a certain set of rules and criteria and limiting the information available and manipulating people on the conscious subconscious levels so that you know what they're going to do. And that's what all the data collection and data gathering and the algorithms that are used, that's what all that is aimed at, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's getting that
The
unity and
visual that I
uniformity.
get is a really neurotic with a net who catches butterflies and then pins them to a styrofoam block. And that's it. He's got multiplicity taken it down to uniformity. There's 100 different kinds of butterflies, and now they're dead and stuck to some styrofoam. And that's his uniform butterfly collection. And that's really who's in charge of us. This isn't a scientific method. It's a collector, which is a similar mindset, frankly, to a serial killer.
Right. Yeah. And he admits that even later in this, like next page, basically, he talks about the will to order. So it's this impulse to impose order upon confusion. And he says that it can be a good thing if it's dealing with art, for example. But then he says on 38 that the will to order becomes really dangerous in the realm of politics and economics. In politics, he says, the equivalent of a fully developed scientific theory or philosophical system is a totalitarian dictatorship,
Mhm.
right? So the butterflies are not free to flutter around and explore and navigate where their senses and intuition and instinct guides them. They're pinned down, they're in order, they're cataloged, they're labeled, they're in the drawer where they're supposed to be. They can never again reproduce, move around, live, explore, or be in their natural environments in the way that they are designed to be, right?
Mhm.
So this will to order leads to a totalitarian dictatorship. Or, he says, in economics, the equivalent of a beautifully composed work of art is the smoothly running factory in which the workers are perfectly adjusted to the machines. And that reminded me of Mustafa Mond and
Mhm.
how the character was inspired by a real life industrialist whose factory Huxley went to visit And Huxley was so impressed by this guy that he got his name. He was called Alfred Mond. And
Mhm.
that's where Mustafa's second name comes from, is this real life person, Alfred Mond, who ran a factory, and it was so organized and it was so smoothly running, and the workers were perfectly adjusted to the machines, that Huxley took that name and put it into his book.
Mhm. I'm not going to switch over document cam, but this section that you've marked off, this is one that Alan made a point of marking, and he like double marked the line there that said, "The beauty of tidiness is used as a justification for despotism."
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It's
Mm.
so every single paragraph is worth quoting.
I
Everyone, get out there and get a copy of this
know.
book and read it. It's really hard to pick out the best quotes. But yeah, he goes on to talk about the dehumanizing effects of over organization, and how industry draws an ever greater proportion of humanity into large cities, but that life in large cities is not conducive to mental health. And then this bit on page 39 for my edition, he says, living in cities, nor does it foster the kind of responsible freedom within small self governing groups, which is the first condition of a genuine democracy. So I thought that bit was very interesting to me as well, because on the topic of freedom and the importance of individual rights and the specialness of people, just on a person by person basis, there that to have, if you did want to have a genuine true democracy, you would need to have these small self-governing groups, and that is the
Mhm.
furthest thing that you have in a city. Yeah,
Mhm.
and even in towns and villages, you're probably more likely to find that. But it was just a curious admission, and I think another key part of what freedom actually is and what it
Mhm.
would actually look like, and how it's been totally, all but eradicated pretty much for most of us, and how city life has been weaponized, and we are now even still living through agendas where people are being herded and into cities, and life is
Mhm.
more convenient there, and you can earn more money there, and the entertainment is there and the opportunity is there, and if you want to hang on to your rural lifestyle, then you're going to get taxed to the hilt and pushed off the
Mhm.
land, and
Mhm.
life is going to be made very, very hard for you. We just had a whole furor here in England about the inheritance tax, which has hit farmers incredibly hard, meaning that they are struggling now to build a legacy to pass on to their children, and it's forcing a lot of them to sell up early ahead of time, to make ends meet, and a lot of their children are going to be end up probably moving their way towards the cities,
Mhm.
uh, all again by design, all done on purpose, and not at all organic or accidental. It's not just because rural people are waking up suddenly and going, oh, the cities are so much better with their synthetic lighting and lack of plants and animals. You know,
Mhm.
it's all been done deliberately, slowly, gradually. The kind of Fabian ways move people into the city. So interesting to see Huxley sort of admitting here. Oops, sorry about that. So admitting here that saying that city life is anonymous and abstract. People are related to one another not as total personalities, but as the embodiments of economic functions, or when they are not at work, as irresponsible seekers of entertainment. I thought he hit the nail on the head there describing city
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
And
There's
then
a, oh, go ahead.
just more broadly, and then he kind of widens it out. On the same page, he says civilization is the process by which primitive packs are transformed into an analog, crude, and mechanical, an analog, crude and mechanical of the social insects' organic communities. So he's saying that civilization it's an analog of that, but it's crude and it's mechanical. So it's this image of the beehive, and then he goes on to talk about, I didn't know how to pronounce this, but it's the structure that termites live in. Termitery?
Yes,
Term,
that was the first
termitery?
time I had encountered that too. But yeah, that's a termitery. Stay on that page there because I don't want to switch over. But there's an Allen marking right above what you were reading. Biologically speaking, it starts
Yeah.
off. Now he marked off that whole paragraph that you just read there, but he said man is a moderately gregarious, not a completely social animal. And I think this is important because there's a lot of discussion. We've been told how social we are. So man is a moderately gregarious, not a completely social animal, a creature more like a wolf, let us say, or an elephant than like a bee or an ant. And this next sentence here, I think is just so good to think about, what were we original before? Because don't forget, cities are a completely artificial construction. In their original form, human societies bore no resemblance to the hive or the ant heap. They were merely packs.
Yeah.
And this speaks to something individual, innate to human nature. You even sometimes they describe a wolf as being a lone wolf. So the point, the concession he's making is that in a natural state or a more primitive state, what you have is the banding together of creatures that are more individual, you know, traveling
And
in a
this
pack. Yeah.
this links back as well to what the was it the maybe the first chapter or the or maybe the foreword about the manipulation of the environment,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where I was saying I hadn't really considered that as a way to um, influence behavior, but of course it is, obviously. Why do you want
Absolutely.
everyone in cities? Well, it's an environment you control and you designed, and they have to use the services and the infrastructure that you've put in there. And then once people are in there, you can continue to tighten the screws and enhance and change and design and alter that environment uh, according to your will and your desire. Versus if people had land and they were able to build using natural resources to grow food, to keep animals, to enjoy the connection with the earth and nature and the cycles of the seasons, then that is a much more healthy and suitable place for humans in there and what they are sort of biologically designed for, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He talks here about the organization man and the social ethic. And this is interesting. He quotes William White in his book, The Organization Man. And you're right here because the Organization Man is another book that Alan quoted from several times in his different talks. But White shows that a new social ethic is replacing our traditional ethical system. So the traditional system was the system in which the individual is primary. And the key words in this new social ethic are adjustment, adaptation, socially oriented behavior, belongingness, acquisition of social skills, teamwork, group living, group loyalty, group dynamics, group thinking, group creativity. So it's just interesting that they're saying, before our traditional ethical system was the individual was primary.
And all that stuff is the kind of the collectivism. It's
Mhm.
the supremacy of the group over the individual, and your obligation now to fit in and become
Mhm.
absorbed by the Borg.
Mhm.
Not absorbed, assimilated.
Yes.
I don't want to be making any Star Trek fans in the audience mad. Do you think that's it for this chapter, or is there any more to?
I found it. I did find the right term here. I don't think I need to switch cameras, but they were world controllers. This was going back to Brave New World, and I think that this is what we should be calling them. I've never I that crossed my mind when I read that. It's, elite is just too nice a word for them.
Agreed.
Oligarchy is too vague. You got to go to the dictionary and, and then you're into archies again. I mean, they're control freaks, and so I think we should just let Huxley have it. Let's give it to him. They're world controllers.
Fantastic. And I'm really glad you caught that because I think I would have missed it. But yeah, this page, I did tab it. And the lead up to that phrase, world controllers, he says, in the more efficient dictatorships of tomorrow, there will probably be much less violence than under Hitler and Stalin. The future dictators' subjects will be painlessly regimented by a corps of highly trained social engineers.
Mhm.
And then he gives a quote again from which I think is from that. I'm not sure actually where he's quoting from at this point. But yeah, he goes on to say the 21st century, I suppose, will be the era of world controllers, the scientific caste system, and Brave New World.
Mhm.
And then he asks, and then he asks quite a funny question here because he asked the question of who will guard the guards or who
Yes,
will
yeah,
engineer the
yes,
engineers,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he says the answer is a bland denial that they need any supervision. There seems to be a touching belief among certain PhDs in sociology that PhDs in sociology will never be corrupted by
Of
power.
course not. And not one of them has ever fudged on one of their peer-reviewed papers. Never.
Oh no, of course not. That could never happen.
So can we, before we launch into the chapter 4, which is propaganda in a democratic society, can we break for a minute? And then we'll just
Absolutely.
come back. Oh, okay.
I don't have as many highlights and tags for this next chapter.
I've got a couple. If I can docu-cam this one and so this is propaganda in a democratic society. And I'll just make the comment right now that he has this chapter and then the next one, which is propaganda under a dictatorship. And what struck me in reading chapter 5 is that we are there where, it's actually propaganda under a dictator. That's really what it feels like. I mean, Alan was always telling us that democracy was a pretty plastic term anyway. He starts this off by saying the doctrines of Europe, Thomas Jefferson wrote, were that men in numerous associations cannot be restrained within the limits of order and justice except by forces physical and moral wielded over them by authorities independent of their will. We, this is the founders of the new American democracy, believe that man was a rational animal endowed by nature with rights and an innate sense of justice, and that he could be restrained from wrong and protected in right by moderate powers, confided to persons of his own choice and held to their duties by dependence on his own will. Now, Huxley says, and now we know better, right? Because we've had Freud and we have the id and the unconscious. Well, we kind of know what function Freud was serving, I think, or we should know what function Freud was serving. So, but back when people didn't know any better, they thought that man had rights that were conferred on him by nature. Now we know better. So that was just kind of funny.
Yeah, he refers to that mindset as quaint.
Yes. But he does go on to talk about how democratic institutions are reconciling the social order with individual freedoms. And at the bottom, this is my page 54, and I think I'm probably about 3 pages ahead of your count. But he said liberalism flourishes in an atmosphere of prosperity and declines as declining prosperity makes it necessary for the government to intervene ever more frequently and drastically in the affairs of its subjects. And then he goes on to blame overpopulation and overorganization. But liberalism isn't like a liberal versus a conservative. This would be those Enlightenment ideals that we'll put under the umbrella of liberalism, and one of those things would be personal freedom. And he said that flourishes in an atmosphere of prosperity and declines as declining prosperity makes it necessary for government to intervene. And I think what we've seen really since World War II are not impersonal forces, but actual agendas and techniques for making sure that that our prosperity declines, because this is part of the process of taking away individual liberties. So that struck me. I called it liberalism and poverty. And I also don't have a ton of notes in this section. Not that it's not interesting, it really is. It just didn't strike me as much. I guess to take his words, it was quaint, considering that, I now think we're under totalitarianism. So that's like, oh, that's quaint.
Yep, I agree.
But further down on my page 60, he writes, he's comparing the totalitarian East. So this would be the Soviet bloc. He said, in the totalitarian East, there is political censorship, and the media of mass communication are controlled by the state. In the democratic West, there is economic censorship, and the media of mass communication are controlled by members of the power elite. And I think that this is very true. Now that censorship is under the control of corporations. It's who controls Facebook, who controls Google, who controls Twitter, because this is where the mass communication is really taking place. And so I don't think I need to read it. It is a good section on freedom of the press and universal literacy and so forth. But what he does say on my page 61, 60 going into 61, is that it was a given. I think I'll just read this little bottom section here. In regard to propaganda, the early advocates of universal literacy and a free press envisaged only two possibilities. The propaganda might be true, or it might be false. They did not foresee what in fact has happened, above all in our Western capitalist democracies, the development of a vast mass communications industry concerned in the main neither with the true nor the false, but with the unreal, the more or less totally irrelevant. In a word, they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. And I think this is true. He goes on to describe the kinds of dramas that you are given, or the kinds of, stadium things that you'd be given in Rome that we might now call sporting events. But these are things that Alan pointed out, that they would take us to a place where we could no longer distinguish fact from fiction. And also, he pointed out it was a Fox case from several years ago where some journalists did an episode, and the network decided that they didn't want to run it, and the journalists sued Fox, and the judge ruled that news it's not the business of news to tell the truth. So, it's really programming, and they can program whatever they want to program. And just because something is true doesn't mean that it's going to be run on the network, which implies that they therefore might be running some things on there that are untrue in the name of their programming.
Yeah,
But
and he kind of like summarizes this really well at the end of that chapter because he's on the topic of programming. He draws the parallel with the novel Brave New World, and he talks about the quote non-stop distractions of the most fascinating nature, the feelies, orgy porgy, and my personal favorite, centrifugal bumble puppy. It's got to be my favorite phrase, I think, from the whole Brave New
centrifugal
World book.
bumble puppy.
And he says these are deliberately used as instruments of policy for the purpose of preventing people from paying too much attention to the realities of the social and political situation. That's in Brave New World, right? Then he goes on to say, a society, most of whose members spend a great part of their time not on the spot, not here and now and in the calculable future, but somewhere else, in the irrelevant other worlds of sport and soap opera, of mythology and metaphysical fantasy, will find it hard to resist the encroachments of those who would manipulate and control it.
Mhm.
I think that says it all right there.
It does, and I think that because we're so well studied, and they know that we love entertainment and that we really demand it. When Alan said that it will be hard for people to distinguish fact from fiction, this is by design, and I think nowhere do we see this tendency in ourselves more clearly than in the last several years, the last going on 5 years now, because the official narrative of what was happening was so distorted by design that it opened the door for all kinds of theories to come out. Oh, it's not that. It didn't happen this way. It didn't happen that way. It's this, and it becomes really a form of entertainment. You see, and you can tell yourself, I'm, getting to the bottom of the truth here. And so you can spend days and weeks and months pursuing a line of inquiry that has been put out there for you to look at. And that's what has made this so challenging. So to me, these dusty old books that you are surrounded by is a much more beneficial exercise of understanding the recent history, because recent history is so manipulated to the end of being entertaining, because it is and Huxley even talks about this, why do people jump into something? Because it's entertaining, and
Yeah.
they tell themselves, oh, I have to have the answer, I have to know the truth, but the hunt is entertaining.
Yeah. And I think it reminds me of a wonderful word, conspiratainment.
Hmm.
And actually, that reminds me I think I'm right in saying that's a portmanteau where you smoosh two words together to come up with a third word.
Yes.
And the other day I was thinking about portmanteau and trying to come up with an example, and now I have my example that I'm going to use from now on. So, yeah, conspiratainment, where you're given all these outrageous stories and talking heads and narratives and explanations and whistleblowers and insiders and the
Hmm.
truth about this and it's a never ending hamster wheel. It's so fascinating. It's so
Hmm.
interesting. It's so mind blowing. This changes everything. Look, you got to watch this video, and you're sharing it to people and talking about people, and you can't. But where's it really going? You know?
Exactly. And there was a portmanteau that was formed more than a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, called conspirituality. And I've
Ooh,
actually
I like that
written,
one.
yeah, I've written about that. So, you can't mock conspirituality. You can mock conspiratainment because, entertainment is secular. But the spiritual, that's sacred. So you can't mock it when someone takes on the conspiracy to the point of they're devoted to it. And that has been seamlessly blended for some years now. But we certainly saw that again, heightened in the last few years. It makes the pursuit then, some kind of a religious calling. It's,
Right.
it's,
Yeah, and it's
it's
interesting
interesting.
because there is a certain element of to sort of link back to what you were saying about books and reading the books. That's exactly why I prefer to do what I do and the way I do it is because there's no end of to the link slinging and the new podcast that came out and the video interview
Mhm.
and it's really exhausting to try and keep up with all that. So it's a much slower pace of doing things. But the sorry, I forgot where I was going to go. What the point I was going to make just
Well,
there.
you were saying why you like doing what you're doing, that I
But
think.
there was a point with the conspirituality and the conspiratainment that I was going to bring in. I lost it.
Oh, um,
Yeah, that's it.
it's-
That's what we get for insulting the conspirituality, right?
clear your head, vibrate at a higher level, and it will come back to you.
I need to raise my frequency.
That's it. Well, shall we launch into propaganda under a dictatorship?
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to pick up the pace. We've got to move faster.
Well, we got a lot to do. We might have to split this into two videos. I don't know. What do you think? I don't think we're halfway through the book yet. Let's see.
No, we're not. We've been at it for about an hour and a half, a little bit longer than an hour and a half. So
All right, I'll just go
let's
to
poll
the.
the imaginary audience.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think? Hands up. Give us a thumbs up, a like, a share, and a comment, and a subscribe if you want. Smash that like button. That's what everyone says, isn't it? Smash
Yeah,
that like button.
that's it. Just gently tap it.
Yeah, just click it like you would any other button. It'll still work. All right, chapter 5. Let's get the book. So this is the one you said you felt like was describing the way things are in the present day, propaganda in a
Absolutely.
dictatorship.
Yep.
And with this being written in 1959, the hot thing that had happened, the big development was World War II, which very conveniently enough, Aldous Huxley wasn't drafted into and managed to, I think, well, he had bad eyesight, didn't he? That's what got
Mhm.
him out of it.
Mhm. Well, there's something on this page here. He is setting it up with the Second World War, but he's talking about how dictators needed highly qualified assistants, even at the lowest level, men who could think and act independently. So they couldn't just follow, they had to be capable of, making their own decision, but they had to be, party men going along with the dictator. And he writes, the totalitarian system in the period of modern technical development can dispense with such men. Thanks to modern methods of communication, it is possible to mechanize the lower leadership. As a result of this, there has arisen the new type of the uncritical recipient of orders. And Alan's note here, right there, is just doing my job, sir. And we saw this so effectively in the last few years. I don't know if they called them this worldwide, but the Karens. You had the
Mhm.
Karens, the enforcers who were like, that's not up over your nose. You came into the store, but you did not use the hand sanitizer, So these are people who are so well trained by the system, which I maintain is totalitarian, that they are the enforcers and they don't even have to be on the payroll.
Do you know the amazing thing about them that I found as well was that they seemed to be suddenly activated,
Yes.
like they were dormant and they were like Manchurian candidates or something. You know, they were sleeper agents, and then this event kicked off, and then suddenly they were the that part of them was switched on,
Hmm.
and they became, and because maybe they already had been, and maybe they just didn't feel emboldened enough to go full tilt with that inclination to authoritarianism. But this event, because it was worldwide, it was on the news, everybody knew about it, it affected everybody, and you could participate with enforcing it with a clear conscience, knowing that you were on the side of right, helping people, saving people,
Hmm.
protecting the vulnerable and the innocent. But it just seemed to switch on in some people, and I always wonder if that was planted there ahead of
Hmm.
time by
Hmm.
some, I don't know, maybe I'm kind of spitballing, but I don't know about in America. In England, we have in secondary school, we have a prefect system where certain students will be given a little badge, and you have to like monitor the hallways at lunchtime and break time and make sure the other students aren't going where they're not supposed to, or you have certain responsibilities,
Hmm.
but largely you're enforcing the school rules on the non-prefect students, right?
Hmm.
And I wonder if that could be a candidate for training people for this event that was going to happen later in their lives, where they would be emboldened to switch on their inner authoritarian.
That's a good point. That is a good point. Or, you know, I don't remember where I read it or heard it, but it was recently that someone was writing about, the obedience to authority, these different experiments, and there is I can't remember the name of the one who ran it out of Stanford, but it was the Stanford prison experiment. And
Zimbardo, was it?
yes, yes, it was Zimbardo. Thank you. So you had the prison guards and the prisoners, and they were role playing, and half of them were prisoners and half were prison guards. And Zimbardo said it was amazing how quickly, I mean, in under 24 hours, people adapted to their role. And this was what was most instructive to him about this is they really took it on. They became the prison guard. They became the prisoner, the victor.
So I'll just let
Ah,
people know while we've got the
just
book camp set up that you can
great.
get Philip Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect: How Good People Turn Evil. This
Ah,
is quite a recent one. It's quite a thick book.
have you read it yet?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it looks
I
good.
saw it in a fairly mainstream bookshop, and I thought, I know that guy. I've
Yeah.
heard that name before. I've heard of the.
Yep.
So this is
Absolutely.
kind of a look back on it. 2007, this was published. So this is a sort of retrospect. And
Uh-huh.
look at the size of the text in there. That is
Oh
tiny
yeah.
writing.
Yeah.
So
Tiny writing and lots of it. But
yes,
that is the point. I think that there's something that remember this was gamed out. What we've lived through was gamed and strategized and modeled and practiced. And then it was put upon us, and people, of course, because we have free will, chose their role. You might have just been the non-compliant. That might have been your role, your character. But there were a lot of people who they decided that their character was enforcer, and that's
yeah.
interesting, very
Well,
interesting.
we might have a bit of a help in understanding where that was from Huxley. So in the same chapter, this is a bit that I've underlined. It's on page 63 in my edition, which I'll just show the front cover for anybody there. It's a 19, what did I say it was? 1963 edition.
Mhm.
He says, today, the art of mind control is in process of becoming a science. The practitioners of this science know what they are doing and why. They are guided in their work by theories and hypotheses solidly established on a massive foundation of experimental evidence. So that
Mhm.
just totally reinforces and backs up what you were just saying. This was game. They have a massive foundation of experimental evidence. This was in 1959. Imagine how much more evidence they've accrued
Mhm.
in the lead up to the Big C
Absolutely.
events, right?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
so it's a science. They've turned it into. They've learned how to do it. They understand it. Experiments such as this one, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison experiments, and the other experiments around conformity, the Ash conformity
Yes,
experiment, and
yes.
the Milgram experiment as well. Those three, the three big ones, uh, prime evidence and proof that mind control has been studied. It has been established as a science, and then what are you going to do with it? Well, you're not just going to figure out how to do with it and then put that knowledge on the shelf and never use it, are you?
Well, no, it's too good to go to waste.
Once you've, yeah, if you put all that money into figuring out how to do it, you're not just going to be like, okay, now we know how to do that. Let's make sure, let's just lock it in a safe and make sure
But
nobody ever does
remember,
it.
Huxley said earlier that the scientists and the PhDs and everything they would never abuse it. And they were upstanding and good. So yeah.
Yeah, nobody, they don't, there doesn't need to be any oversight over the
No, no, no,
PhDs,
no.
right?
Nobody needs to guard those guardians.
So yeah, there's like a discussion in this chapter of Hitler and some of and he refers to Hitler's writings quite a lot
Yes,
and
he
and
does.
quotes quite extensively in this chapter. Uh, One bit here that I underlined was the first principle from which Hitler started was a value judgment. The masses are utterly contemptible, which sounds a lot like Huxley's
Huxley?
own attitude, yeah, to the masses, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The illiterate,
Those teeming illiterates.
the teeming illiterates. And then more discussion as well, talking about the masses and how he's talking about how Hitler made a strong appeal to the members of the lower middle classes who were ruined by the inflation of 1923, and then
Mhm.
again in 1929, the Depression. The masses of whom he speaks were these bewildered, frustrated, and chronically anxious millions. And then
Mhm.
Huxley says, to make them more mass like, more homogeneously subhuman, he assembled them by the thousands and the tens of thousands in vast halls and arenas where individuals could lose their personal identity, even their elementary humanity, and be merged with the crowd. So
Mhm.
again, it's that attack upon the individual, the squeezing out of differences, of uniqueness, of that that innate individuality that we all have. We are similar but different in very meaningful and important ways. Get rid of that. Hold these, as you mentioned, hold these at night. These massive meetings, get huge crowds together, and then I think he mentions later. Is it here? I think where he talks about how Hitler was trained in his, the way he delivered speeches. I might be like mixing that up with something else that I read or heard
Well,
recently.
it does, he does say here that when Hitler wrote about, and he said several different things that he was writing about. I think one of them was race, and one was history and providence and so forth. That said he's unreadable. But I'll just docu-cam here for a moment. It said, when he writes about the German masses and the methods he used for dominating and directing them, his style changes. Nonsense gives place to sense, bombast to a hard-boiled and cynical lucidity. In his philosophical lucubrations, Hitler was either cloudily daydreaming or reproducing other people's half-baked notions. In his comments on crowds and propaganda, he was writing of things he knew by firsthand experience. And I don't know if this was his biographer Bullock, or if I think this might have been Hitler. Yeah, it was Hitler himself said, to be a leader means to be able to move the masses. His aim was first to move the masses and then, having pried them loose from their traditional loyalties and moralities, to impose on them, with the hypnotized consent of the majority, a new authoritarian order of his own devising. Now, this is interesting too. We'll get to this a little bit later, but imposing on him anew, Huxley writes about Pavlov and the dogs, and it's just heartbreaking. But once they're broken down and they take on the new conditioning, they can never be returned, never, to what they were before,
Yeah, that's right.
because they've been broken. And I really do think that if you apply this to man, that this is what we're seeing. So once they've been freed from their traditional loyalties and moralities because of this kind of mass manipulation, they won't return to that. They then are, um, well, they're under their unconscious drives. Now, there is a place here on my page 71 where he talks about, the individual has an ability to use logic and retain their morals and so forth. But assembled in a crowd, people lose their powers of reasoning and their capacity for moral choice. Their suggestibility is increased to the point where they cease to have any judgment or will of their own. They become very excitable. They lose all sense of individual or collective responsibility. And that's an interesting thing. They no longer have any sense of themselves or being accountable for themselves, but they also don't have any sense of being responsible for the collective. And they are subject to sudden accesses of rage, enthusiasm, and panic. In a word, a man in a crowd behaves as though he had swallowed a large dose of some powerful intoxicant. He is a victim of what I have called herd poisoning, and I love that term. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
He said he calls this herd poisoning. Like alcohol, herd poison is an active, extroverted drug. The crowd intoxicated individual escapes from responsibility, intelligence, and morality into a kind of frantic animal mindedness or mindlessness, frantic animal mindlessness. Alan's note here is mass hysteria.
Wow.
Now,
Mass hysteria, and just reminds me straight away of Matthias Desmet
yes,
and his phrase mass
Matt,
psychosis. No, it was mass formation.
yes, mass formation.
And then
And
somebody added the word psychosis to
yeah,
it
that was
later on,
Robert
didn't they?
Malone.
But he
Yeah.
just said mass
Yes,
formation.
yes, he did. He said mass formation. I'm not sure. There were some good points in that book that I enjoyed and got a lot from, but I'm not sure that formation is a better word than hysteria. Um, I can see it used both ways. Formation imparts to me that there's someone above who is forming the mass. Hysteria is a less manageable crowd, perhaps, but I think for someone like a Hitler or um, those who've been managing us, because they know
The
how to
world
handle
controllers.
hysteria. Yeah, absolutely. But again, Huxley makes this good point. He said during his long career as an agitator, Hitler had studied the effects of herd poison and had learned how to exploit them for his own purposes. He had discovered that the orator can appeal to those hidden forces which motivate men's actions much more effectively than the writer. Now, this is a key point. So oration, and that's going to be anything, and that can be a video nowadays too. What you hear on the radio, what you hear on the internet, what is spoken or what is visually presented to you with words behind it, much more powerful for moving the mass. Huxley writes, reading is a private, not a collective activity. The writer speaks only to individuals sitting by themselves in a state of normal sobriety. The orator speaks to masses of individuals who are already primed with herd poison.
Well, yeah. That phrase there, herd poison, works on so many levels to describe, the Big C event,
Mm-hmm.
because it the whipping up of the frenzy
Mm-hmm.
and the fear in order to control the behavior, but then the much vaunted and touted solution to the situation as well could also be described as a herd poison, I would say. But yeah, that quote there about reading being private and not a collective activity, I thought was very powerful and important, and very aligned with the work, Alan's work and what we do on this channel and others as well. When you are reading a book silently on your own, it's between you and that writer, and you are actively participating in the interpretation of those words and those ideas, and you are you're engaging actively, versus standing and listening to a speech or watching a video or listening to a podcast. You are passive. You're more like the in the hypnotic suggestive state that is created by television, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You're receiving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, reading has an element of receiving, but you need to be engaging and active as well. So I always make the point that the reading is much more active than watching a documentary or a video of some kind. And I think for that reason, it's a superior way to learn and to engage and to improve your own knowledge in order to gain understanding and wisdom to share with other people.
Reading requires, whatever you're reading, it requires that you involve your imagination. And when you have when you've got visuals that have already been added into it, it really, lops off the imagination. It kind of puts it to the side. I'm going to read one other little section here towards the very end of that, and it is what the propagandist should do according to Hitler. The propagandist should adopt a systematically one-sided attitude towards every problem that has to be dealt with. How have we seen this? There's no other way of seeing it, right? It's just totally this way. He must never admit that he might be wrong. Trust the big S, right? You got to trust the S, follow the S. Or that people with a different point of view might even be partially right. No, they're deniers. Obviously, they're not right. Opponents should not be argued with. They should be attacked, shouted down, or they become too much of a nuisance. Then liquidate them. The masses are always convinced that right is on the side of the active aggressor. Skipping down a little bit, Huxley writes, mindlessness and moral idiocy are not characteristically human attributes. They are symptoms of herd poisoning.
That's it. And
And
there's a couple of quotes that I want to get on as well, if I could.
oh, good. Yeah, I hope you're going to get the one about. Okay. Yes.
I want to backtrack a little bit
Oh, okay.
because he kind of pays a compliment here. And I think it's a compliment that should be recognized and well received by people in the audience, which he says, unlike the masses, intellectuals have a taste for rationality and an interest in facts. Their critical habit of mind makes them resistant to the kind of propaganda that works so well on the majority. So if there's anybody out there who did manage to swerve the mass hypnosis, the mass hysteria that took place, then Huxley considers you an intellectual. And I also put above that individuals. I think you could kind of swap out those words there. But he says as well of intellectuals, they are the kind of people who demand evidence and are shocked by logical inconsistencies and fallacies. Okay,
Mhm.
so that's another characteristic. And then further down, the again quoting from Hitler, which is that only constant repetition will finally succeed in imprinting an idea upon the memory of a crowd.
Mhm.
Okay. So
Mhm.
if you are interested in facts and you want evidence and you are shocked by logical inconsistencies and fallacies, then you are an intellectual and you should
And an
recognize
individual.
that. And you're an
Yes.
individual. Yeah. And you should be proud of that and give yourself some credit and some kudos. And because I know that for a lot of people, it can be very alienating and stressful. And we can often feel overwhelmed, perhaps, by all the information and the knowledge that of the way things really work, and seeing these kinds of schemes and agendas rolled out, affecting so many people, perhaps people we love and are close to. But if we ourselves are able to see through it and are able to discern that it is happening, even if you're the only person you know who can do that, take some peace in knowing that there is that Huxley thinks you're an intellectual. So you're doing all right. You got a compliment from him there.
Right, good deal.
And yeah, the other bit I really wanted to get on here was, let me go back up to the cam, uh, which is about virtue and intelligence. Was this the quote you wanted? What you wanted us to get on?
No, but okay, we'll do dueling cameras here. You do your quote and I'll do mine.
All right, this one's really important. Virtue and intelligence, and on the theme of intellectuals and individuals. This is page 68 in my version. He says, virtue and intelligence belong to human beings as individuals, freely associating with other individuals in small groups. So do sin and stupidity. But the subhuman mindlessness to which the demagogue makes his appeal, the moral imbecility on which he relies when he goads his victims into action, are characteristic not of men and women as individuals, but of men and women in masses. Yeah. Um, so I think it's just really a really great revealing analysis of an individual versus the collective and the importance of going your own way, finding out who you are, knowing yourself, being true to your inner compass, your intuition, your what's the word I'm looking for? Your sense of right and wrong,
Mhm.
and allowing that to develop and being true to that. Because as we are learning in this book, the masses are unthinking. They are under mind control. These techniques are well established and well developed. And Hitler was one of the best. And Hitler didn't pop out of nowhere. Was by no means a one, a one-off. The methodology he used and the his rise to power was not something that just happened organically and unplanned. It was done deliberately, and it was done with support and guidance and training, and with all this knowledge that has been accrued through the study of human beings, individual and on a collective basis for, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of
Mhm.
years. I don't know how many, but a lot.
Mhm. No, I think that's a very good point. And also, you know, there are some of us, individuals, intellectuals, however we want to pat ourselves on the back, who've seen through some of this. But I think that the point of the truth for most people is that we weren't born awake. Most of us, maybe not everybody, but most of us have fallen for some form of indoctrination or another, and in some way been herd poisoned. And I think that that's, and
100%. Yeah.
yeah, and that's an important thing to remember. But I think, just one last little thing, just because this was an Alan highlighting here. He said, I don't know if I'm seen here on fully, but he wrote, top of 75, my edition, the kingdom of heaven is within the mind of a person, not within the collective mindlessness of a crowd. And I think that it's so true, no matter whether it's the biggest propaganda that we're given, and we're trying to make our way through the quote, nightly news, whatever we're trying to discern and figure out for ourselves, it has to come within our own mind and our own discernment and our own research, because once you put yourself investigating something that's out there, you have no way of knowing who wrote that, who said that, why did they put it out, what were the circumstances. So it's um, the repeated exercise of thinking for yourself that's really important, and not jumping onto it. Now, we've been going a little over 2 hours, and we are halfway through the book. We can cover this in a second episode. I'm happy to keep going and talking with you now and recording it, although it's getting kind of late in England, so you might not want to do that. Do you think that we should keep going and have one massively long episode, or what is your input on this?
I'd be happy to come back on another video, another call,
Okay.
and do the second half, just because I can refresh my memory. Because I did manage to revise and sort of prep the first half, and we've covered pretty much what I was able to look at before the call. So I'd rather come back and do the second half on another one.
Okay. Well, let's do that. I would like to go ahead though and announce, because I don't know when we'll plug in the second half of this and have time to do it. We can talk about that later, and then I can figure out. I'm scheduling. I think I'm kind of booked up until February. However, it could be an extra, like the special episode that might work. But I wanted to tell people. In fact, I think, Nick, I'll let you, because it
Mhm.
really was you who suggested the next book, and it was a kind of serendipity. I was out on my walk. I didn't realize I already had a copy of it, but why don't you tell everybody what we're covering next so they can start reading it if they want to.
Absolutely. So what tends to happen when you're discussing 1984 and Brave New World, which are the two books that pretty much everybody's heard of, um, every now and again somebody will say, "Ah, but do you know we?" And you'll say, "What do you mean by we?" I know that we are here having a conversation. No, no, no. The book, it's called We. I'm right. So that is going to be the next book. So this book actually predates both 1984 and Brave New World. I think I'm right in saying it came out. Let's see. I don't know if it's going to be
The
in here. Is
the
it
20s, I think.
right?
Yeah.
So this came out in the 20s, and it is an earlier dystopian novel. And I haven't read it in full. I kind of gave it a go. I think I got a few chapters in. So that's going to be the next book. Is Yevgeny Zamyatin's book, We, from the 1920s, which is the dystopia that we think perhaps fed into and inspired some of Orwell's work and Huxley's work. And if I'm not mistaken, described a kind of collectivist situation where people do not have any privacy, and follows the life of an individual in that society who doesn't have a name. I think they all just have numbers in this society, and they live in flats which have glass walls. So that's going to be the next one, following on our theme of dystopian fiction.
So I told this is the copy that I picked up for free. I told you about that. Um, and this was one of those really lovely coincidences that I was out on a walk with my brother, and we passed by the university library, and I know they're open a lot and in the evening, and I needed to use their facility. And so I said, "Oh, hey, let's stop here." And I went in, and he had was visiting the book giveaway shelf. And they always have a few books they're just giving away. And I saw this on the shelf, and I'm like, "Oh, cool. I'm gonna get that and take it." And you suggested it that this be the next thing at that we literally just met up and I said, "Oh, guess what I got for free at the university library?" And you said, "I think the next book that we should do is We." And I'm like, "Well, guess what?" And then subsequently, you've had some of your listeners suggest it to you.
Yeah.
And I've had several of mine, two or three, I think, who've said, "I think that the next book that you and Nick should do is We." And I'm like, well, as it turns out, that's what we're doing. And I think that I found another copy, and this is one that doesn't have any markings in it because I picked it up free at the uni library. But the other one that I found, it doesn't have Alan's markings in it either, but it's a little bit bigger print, which is helpful to me. So I think that'll be the one that I'm working on, but I don't have it in front of me. It is not a huge book, but it's a little bit bigger slightly than what we've covered. I think it's 200. My copy that I'm looking at is 232 pages, but it's not massive. So dive in, and we're likely to be covering this in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think. And
And I suppose we should mention as well, as I've just seen on the when I was looking at the back here. So it is a 1924, the publication date,
oh, okay.
and the main character is called D503,
Okay, great.
and the translation I'm reading is by Hugh Aplin, and they'll be because this book was not originally written in English; it was actually written in Russian, and so that might have a bearing on people's choice. If you want to buy a copy, maybe get the same copy or the same translation we have. We'll still
Well,
be able to discuss.
I'll see what my other copy is. I'm working from a 1972 translation by Mira Ginsburg.
Hmm.
But I'll look Hugh Applin. I'll see if the other copy that I have is that. We'll try to work on that. But of course,
We
it
should
might
at
be.
least coordinate having the same translation, I think.
Well, that would be great. Yeah, that would be good. I'll check it out and see what I've got. So we've covered the first half of Brave New World Revisited. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's just too challenging when there's so many, like you were saying, Nick, this is one that you want to keep on the shelf, one that you'd like to cover in full on your channel, read the entire thing so that it's kind of saved for posterity. And I agree. It's, my copy is well marked up um, and well tabbed. So there's just a lot that you want to refer to. And so if you haven't read it, you can read this really quickly. As full as it is of good things that you want to remember, it's a quick read. And I thank you all. As far as I know, next week is going to be Neil Foster. And I thank you, Nick, for taking the time to do this with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. I really enjoyed it, and we were anticipating to cover the whole thing in this one video, but I suppose we're just going to have a Brave New World revisited episode to finish off the second half. But yeah, I would encourage anybody to grab a copy. Mine was cheap. You know, it's not one of these that are artificially. Well, we'll see what happens before this when this video goes up, but the price is pretty low. There's a lot of copies out there, and it is worth getting and holding on to because it's a good talking point, I think, to people who might be just starting to pay attention, or
Mhm.
people who might be incredulous when you try and explain to them the way things actually work. This is a really good thing to point to. It was written in the in the 50s, and it lays out so much of the agenda and the methods and the true nature of the systems that we've been born into. So yeah, thank you, Melissa. I'll just say as well, it's so cool to see your and Alan's markings in your edition of the book, and I'm really glad you've got a book cam now. And hopefully there'll be more of that to come because as a book nerd, I like to see what other people have underlined and commented on and written in the margins, and it's especially fun to see when I've underlined something that both you and Alan have underlined as well. It makes me feel like I'm like, yes, I'm noticing the right stuff and doing a good job. So thanks for having me on again. And I look very much forward to our next conversation.
Great, me too. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening to this. And we'll be back with part two soon. We're going to go off camera now and discuss it. All right, take care. Bye bye.